Any other questions? Any other, not questions, but just things to
Yes,
explain?
things to
talk
address. I think you're pretty well known amongst our friend circles for kind of thinking like Genesis theories.
Uh-huh.
In the sense of, a lot of people, they say, yeah, I can accept Christianity, but the Genesis thing, the Genesis story, I think it takes humility as a Christian and an apologist to kind of say, look, I'm not 100% sure what goes on in Genesis. It could be completely true, it could be metaphorical.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on some of the theologies or theories from apologists about the Genesis account?
Well, for one thing, me personally, a lot of my belief and thing in Genesis just comes from other things about God in the Bible just being proven true, right? It's like some things are just so crazy, resurrection, like prophecy fulfillment, this, like I just can't look past this like being a made up thing, you know?
The resurrection has not been proven to happen, only been claimed by theologians. Many accounts inside the Bible are factually wrong, such as the Hebrews being in Egypt at the proposed time of Exodus. The Great Flood has been refuted on such a large number of levels that it's begun to lose its comedic value. And let us not forget the genetic mapping of the phylogenetic tree of life, which just eviscerates the account of Genesis, hands down. There is no controversy beyond the continued ignorance of a segment of the human population, aka those who go by the name of young earth creationists.
However, it is still fair to address where did dinosaurs come from and how does that tie into Genesis. An important thing that you'll hear a lot, and it sounds really corny, but it's true, that Genesis isn't a history book, and that wasn't the purpose of it. And yet it's crazy because there actually are some crazy historical things that we can get from it. Like, they do talk about slightly the concept of there being a space from the earth and the sky. And that's interesting because at that time that was not anything that anyone had thought of way before Galileo or any astronomers were alive. So I think that's cool.
Since the first person looked up at the stars, there have always been concepts of space. However, many shared in the same fallacious notions as the Bible, which describes said space not as a vacuum filled with objects orbiting various points of center, but as a solid dome, aka the firmament, which is sometimes referred to as a vault, keeping all the waters apart. This could only be classed as crazy in the negative and highly ableistic fashion.
And then some interesting things too is like that people say Neanderthals weren't mentioned, right? And whether they're not specifically mentioned, I think there's still some things that are in Genesis that really can possibly point to them. Like they talk about before the flood of Noah, the nation of the earth and who was on the earth being people that were not, I don't know, they said like kind of like lacked mentally, but like really bad people, right? And God decided after they had chances and they'd been told, it wasn't like they just were just minding their own business. He decided to wipe them out, but be faithful too, because Noah and his family were fine. And that is really interesting because that would make a lot of sense why there aren't Neanderthals these days, you know? And why there was a period of time that they lived, but all of a sudden they weren't there, you know?
Neanderthals do still exist, at least in part. Genome mapping of humans has shown that people of European and Asian descent have a MHC gene variant which is unseen in populations of humans that remained in Africa. Now, the gene doesn't appear to do all that much beyond offer better immunity to diseases and viruses found in both Europe and Asia. Thus, these populations benefited. Now, a Swedish scientist named Dr. Perbu discovered that this gene appeared in and is likely to have originated from Neanderthal populations. Now, we know that this occurred after Neanderthal and Homo sapiens divided, aka the gene evolved after this point, by displaying the facts that we go back to Africa and the origins of man, we do not find those genes there. Therefore, the two species must have reconverged and the latter crossbred with the former. Beyond that, I must stress that a lot of our notions of Neanderthals are not entirely with basis. we portray them as slow and typically stupid because early science in the field of fossil anthropology was highly elitist, and thus we had a lot of biases and we liked showing older things in such ways. And this was sort of internalized and then impacted by modern media. The reality of what they were actually like is hotly contested to this day. However, maybe we should look at ourselves a little more to understand. Beyond that, I ask you to simply stop your retrofitting, as this merely insults the science you attempt to use, as science should offer clarity in what it discusses, not non-testable vagueness.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Trevor. That's a really good point. I think what Christians face is a battle between other Christians, which shouldn't really be happening, I don't think. Because of course you have the young Earth creationists who believe, the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, which now we can see that that's not the case. And we also look back at the original translation in Genesis, where we take the 7 days and we think it really is the 7 days.
Periods of time.
Right, when it translates, the word actually means a period of time. And so days aren't the necessary unit.
Okay, let's divide the history of the universe into 7 units. The measurable universe is 13.8 billion years old. That means each day or unit represents 1.97 billion years of the universe's 13.8 billion year total. So God apparently created said universe, the heavens and the earth on the first day along with the light. This means that God arrived way too early and created the earth at least 7.3 billion years before it should actually exist during the last quarter of the 5th day, as the earth only actually existed 4.5 billion years ago. Awkward. Not to mention the question as to where the light came from. Move on to day 2, and we have the creation of the firmament, the physical dome across the earth. At the very least, this was 5.3 billion years too early, as the earth would not exist for that long. On the 3rd day, we have the production of all the plants of the earth. At the very least, this was 3.3 billion years before the earth even existed, thus the plants would not actually be able to root themselves, they'd be floating away in space. And I hope I don't have to go into the facts that plants only evolved 1 day ago. They actually evolved on the end of the 6th day apparently, and that's off by over 5 billion years. What's more is that fruiting plants are mentioned, and flowers would not evolve until the last 250 million years, or 0.25 billion, and this just continues on and on and on. But I'm going to stop there, as I think I've made my point. Do you see why this argument does not work? It is simply a disaster. I mean, at the end comes the realization that according to this logic, nothing has evolved or been created in the past 1.97 billion years, as God has been taking one big break all of this time, meaning that we, people, must have evolved before this and before the deadline at the very least. If that were the case, I think we'd be beyond religion by now.
And something really interesting about days is that we still use day to mean a ridiculously long period of time, even in these modern cultures. Like, so say I'm talking with Phil and I'm like, hey Phil, back in the day when I used to play with those Power Ranger toys or whatever, right?
Well, that's true.
Right, and that would mean an absurdly long period of time back when it was just so far back that it's just crazy, right?
No, you're making reference to a specific day as opposed to the time in between. It would be like going, do you remember Egypt as a location? And this is not then referring to the locations we have been in since Egypt. How difficult is that to grasp? What's more is that if you're referring to a time period, you should have pluralized day with days.
Well, and oftentimes too, I don't want to interrupt on
no.
you, but oftentimes we say, in this day and age,
Yeah, exactly.
we use that same exact unit of time. And so I think atheists like to find that and like, oh, day, without reading the context or how limited the people who are the, at the time of
Vocabulary.
Moses, right? The vocabulary was
4,000
extraordinarily
Yeah,
low.
4,000 Hebrew words compared to, it's like 1.5 million English. That's insane. Like, the ratio to that is just, it's crazy. Like, I mean, that'd be about the same as like, so let's say there's like a contest being held, right? And there's a family that's a billionaire, and the billionaire family gives away a $500,000 check. And people are like, wow, that's a lot of money, right? $500,000 is a ton of money.
That is.
But do you know what, for that billionaire, that would be like? That would be like a average family giving away it'd be like a family that makes $75,000 a year about giving away like $15 or $10, right? So, I mean, just as like that like thing is so crazy and everything, it's about the same with like Hebrew and English, right? This many Hebrew words for that many English words, there's some things that like just cannot be expressed in as much detail.
Day and age. Are you not actually hearing what you are stating? I mean, I am amazed at how you don't seem to understand that these examples fail spectacularly. As for language, how is language a barrier for an all-knowing, all-powerful deity? He could have added to the language. He could have zapped everyone full with language capable of dealing with this concept. Yet by claiming that this failure comes as a failure to language, you have refuted your own definition of a deity as all-knowing and powerful as words. They're God's kryptonite. I mean, what are you, Islam?
Yeah, I really like your point. You seem to have a lot of good cultural background, kind of at what time this was written. And actually, I know we're hopping a lot of different places on apologetics, but I did want to address just a little bit with you, Trevor, just because you do have kind of a good background on this, and it would be good for the rest of us here, is the taking out of context. Atheists, I see on blog pages all the time. One of my close friends has some of these blogs listed, some Bible verses taken out of context without the rest of the passage, or looking at context. And you take it one glance. I think it's in Corinthians, of women should not speak in church and women should be covered on their heads.
Yep.
And one person might freak out when they first read that, but when you actually take a look at this particular church, it's written in history that this church at this time was kind of a rowdy group, and especially the women were rowdy.
Yep.
And lots of noise, lots of weird practices that they would often lure their husbands into, and which was spiritually deviant from Christ and from Christ's teaching. And so the elders at this church, it was needed that the women would keep quieter.
Right.
And the context helps you how? All this does is compact the sexist notion that women are the vile temptresses who must remain silent, which was the sexist idea being challenged in the first place. God is setting out that these people have less value to their word due to an aspect of themselves that they did not choose, which was their gender, if you don't know. How does that defeat the problem? All it shows is that Christian apologists are too incapable to grasp this fact, to understand and register the initial issue, and just say a large amount of word salad to give off the impression of having made a point.
And I mean, yeah, all those authors that address that, and like, I think it's Corinthians when they talk about that, 1 Corinthians. And so any author that's writing biblically, it's true, they are like spiritually commissioned from God and inspired to write those books. It's not like the Old Testament or the New Testament, when those verses come up, it's not like something we should ignore and be like, oh, well, yeah, that's just that doesn't count or something. No, they are totally true and valid. But that's a great point. You have to look at the culture, like Leviticus when it talks about no tattoo marks. That's all cultural, and that was actually in the Old Testament when the law was what standard what we were held to. And I think that's actually really interesting because God wanted to push these people to make some tougher choices and prove the faith for Him. So, I don't know, I think that's really interesting.
Right, but aside from being interesting, how does the notion of cultural context save your position? If the morality at the time, as supposedly laid down by your God, is merely subject to the culture which existed at the time, then your God's supposed morality is subjective, and said morality becomes indistinguishable from the cultural morality. Ergo, we may as well apply Occam's razor and simply cut God out as an unnecessary assumption. But as a finishing note, I would very much enjoy seeing you give the supposed context of the following. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Now, from the previous biblical discussion on slavery found in Exodus chapter 21, I know that slave in the Bible means a person you own who is yours to beat within an inch of their life, so long as they don't directly die from you. Only male Hebrew slaves must be set free after a period, and even then it gives you instructions on how to keep them for their entire life. I would be most interested in your apparent wisdom here.